Federal prison versus state prison. Why federal time is worse for most people. Prison is prison. Concrete walls, steel doors, locked cells, and years spent waiting for freedom. But inside America's correctional system, not all prison sentences are the same. Many people assume state prison is the harsher experience. State facilities often have reputations for violence, overcrowding, and gang activity. Federal prisons, on the other hand, are frequently portrayed as cleaner, safer, and more organized. Yet countless inmates who have experienced both systems tell a different story. According to many former prisoners, federal time can be far more difficult in ways most people never expect. The buildings may look newer. The routines may appear more orderly. The violence may be less visible. But behind those walls exists a level of control that can make years feel much longer than anyone imagined. Tonight, we're examining the reality behind federal prison and state prison, uncovering why so many inmates believe federal time is actually worse. And as you'll discover, the reasons have very little to do with comfort. What happens when a prison controls every minute of your existence? Why do some inmates fear federal investigations more than violent prison yards? And why do prisoners often say that surviving federal time requires a completely different mindset? The answers begin with a misconception that has existed for decades. Before we continue, subscribe if you enjoy in-depth crime and prison documentaries, and leave a comment sharing where you're watching from. Now let's step inside a world most people never see. A world where the difference between federal and state prison can change the entire course of a person's life. The two prison systems. To understand why federal time can feel worse, we first need to understand the difference between the two systems. State prisons house people convicted of violations of state law. Murder, robbery, assault, burglary, drug offenses prosecuted by state authorities. Each state operates its own prison system, creating significant differences across the country. Federal prisons are different. They are operated by the Federal Bureau of Prisons and house individuals convicted of federal crimes. Large-scale drug trafficking, bank robbery, fraud, public corruption, firearms offenses, organized crime, interstate criminal activity, and many white-collar crimes. At first glance, federal facilities often appear superior. Many are newer. Many are cleaner. Resources are generally more consistent. Some inmates even arrive believing they are entering an easier environment. But what they soon learn is that prison is not defined only by physical conditions. It's defined by freedom. And federal prisons are designed to take control of nearly every aspect of life. That becomes clear almost immediately after arrival. The shock of federal sentencing. One of the first reasons federal time feels worse happens before an inmate ever enters prison. Federal sentencing laws are notoriously unforgiving. For decades, federal prosecutors have relied on sentencing guidelines that often produce lengthy prison terms. A person convicted in federal court frequently discovers that the sentence handed down is only the beginning of the punishment. In state systems, parole opportunities may exist. Sentence reductions can sometimes occur. Release mechanisms vary from state to state. Federal prison operates differently. For crimes committed after 1987, parole in the federal system largely disappeared. Most federal inmates must serve at least 85% of their sentence. And many serve even more. That means a 10-year sentence often means almost exactly 10 years. There are no illusions. No expectations of early release. No rumors about a parole board suddenly changing your future. The calendar becomes brutally predictable. And for some prisoners, that certainty is psychologically devastating. Because when hope disappears, time begins to move differently. What happens next makes that feeling even worse. The distance problem. One of the least discussed aspects of federal prison is geography. The Federal Bureau of Prisons manages institutions across the entire country. An inmate from New York might end up in Texas. Someone from California could be transferred to Pennsylvania. A prisoner from Florida may suddenly find himself thousands of miles from home. The consequences are enormous. Families struggle to visit. Children grow up without seeing their parents. Relationships collapse. Support systems disappear. In state prison, inmates are often housed closer to home. Not always, but often enough. Federal prisoners frequently find themselves isolated from everyone they know. Weeks become months. Months become years. Phone calls replace human contact. Birthdays are missed. Funerals are missed. Entire chapters of life disappear behind concrete walls. Many former inmates say this isolation becomes one of the most painful parts of federal incarceration. Because prison is easier to survive when someone remembers you're there. Federal distance often weakens that connection. And isolation creates opportunities for something even more dangerous. Institutionalization. Life under constant structure. A typical day inside federal prison follows a rigid schedule. Wake-up times, count times, meal times, work assignments, movement periods, recreation windows. Everything operates according to strict structure. State prisons can also be highly controlled, but many federal institutions have developed reputations for extreme routine. Every movement is tracked. Every absence is noticed. Every violation is documented. For some inmates, the structure initially feels manageable. Weeks later, it becomes exhausting. Months later, it becomes suffocating. Years later, it begins reshaping how they think. Former federal prisoners often describe living inside a world where personal decision-making gradually disappears. When to eat, when to move, when to work, when to sleep. Everything is decided for you. The longer that continues, the harder it becomes to imagine life outside. And prison administrators understand this effect very well. Control is often easier than force. But if someone refuses to follow that structure, the consequences can be severe. The federal discipline machine. Federal prisons are known for documentation. Every rule violation generates paperwork. Every incident creates records. Every disciplinary action leaves a trail. At first, that sounds reasonable. But inside prison, those records can shape years of a person's life. Miss a count. Possess unauthorized property. Refuse an order. Participate in prohibited activity. The punishment may not involve immediate violence. Instead, it often involves something inmates fear even more. Lost privileges. Lost visitation. Lost phone access. Lost good conduct time. Transfer restrictions. Housing changes. And sometimes placement in segregation. Unlike the dramatic prison violence often portrayed in movies, federal punishment frequently works through bureaucracy. A single report can affect release dates. A single mistake can alter housing status. A single disciplinary issue can follow an inmate for years. This creates an atmosphere where prisoners constantly calculate risk. One wrong decision can have consequences far beyond the original incident. And that pressure never truly disappears. Yet another force operates beneath the surface. One that many inmates find far more stressful. The prison hierarchy. The hidden power structure. Every prison develops its own social order. Federal prisons are no exception. Although violence may be less visible than in some state facilities, power structures remain deeply influential. Race often plays a role. Geographic affiliations matter. Reputation matters. Connections matter. New arrivals quickly learn that prison has rules beyond those written by administrators. Who sits where? Who associates with whom? Who controls certain activities? Who can be trusted? Who cannot? Ignoring these unwritten rules can create problems faster than breaking official regulations. Federal prisons may appear calmer from the outside, but inmates often describe an environment where social mistakes carry significant consequences. Some conflicts never become physical. Instead, they affect access to protection, information, and opportunities. The prison population itself contributes to this complexity. Because federal facilities often house individuals involved in large criminal organizations. And that changes everything. Criminals who plan for a living. State prisons contain every type of offender imaginable. Federal prisons often contain something different. People convicted through long investigations. Multi-agency operations. Complex conspiracies. Organized criminal enterprises. Financial schemes. Drug networks spanning multiple states. These inmates frequently arrive with experience managing risk, planning operations, and navigating complicated systems. The result is a prison environment where manipulation can be highly sophisticated. Not every federal inmate is dangerous. Far from it. But many possess skills that help them survive criminal enterprises for years. Inside prison, those skills do not simply disappear. They adapt. Information becomes currency. Relationships become strategy. Patience becomes power. Some former prisoners say federal institutions contain fewer impulsive individuals and more calculated ones. And that can create a different type of tension. A quieter tension. One that is harder to predict. Because the biggest threat is not always the loudest person in the room. Sometimes it's the individual nobody notices. And when conflicts emerge, federal investigators often become involved. That's where things take another turn. When the government never stops watching. Federal inmates often describe a feeling that follows them everywhere. Observation. The federal government spent enormous resources investigating many of these individuals before conviction. That attention does not necessarily disappear once prison begins. Phone calls are monitored. Mail may be reviewed. Communications can be scrutinized. Movements are documented. Interactions are observed. For inmates who spent years avoiding law enforcement, this environment can feel relentless. Privacy becomes almost non-existent. Some prisoners compare it to living under a microscope. Every conversation carries potential consequences. Every action can generate reports. Every relationship can attract attention. And when prison becomes a place where even small mistakes are permanently recorded, psychological pressure accumulates quickly. The result is an atmosphere where trust becomes increasingly rare. But perhaps the hardest challenge has nothing to do with surveillance. It involves time itself. And for many inmates, this is where federal prison becomes truly difficult. The weight of long sentences. Federal sentences can be extraordinarily long. 10 years, 20 years, 30 years. Life sentences. Decades behind bars. For many inmates, the reality does not fully register until months after arrival. The courtroom hearing is over. Appeals are exhausted. The media attention disappears. Then comes the realization. This is home. For a very long time. The psychological effects can be profound. Some prisoners become obsessed with routines. Others focus on education. Some dedicate themselves to religion. Others withdraw completely. Survival often depends on finding purpose. Without purpose, years can become overwhelming. Former inmates frequently describe a moment when they stop counting days. The sentence becomes too large, too distant, too difficult to comprehend. Instead, life shrinks into smaller units. 1 meal, 1 week, 1 month, 1 year. Anything larger becomes emotionally exhausting. And what happens when someone loses that battle against time? That answer lies in one of prison's darkest realities. Isolation and the Supermax experience. Not every federal prisoner experiences extreme isolation. But for those assigned to the highest security environments, the consequences can be severe. Special housing units. Administrative segregation. And in the most extreme cases, Supermax confinement. Life inside these units operates differently. Cells become entire worlds. Human contact becomes limited. Conversations become rare. Days blend together. Weeks disappear. The psychological impact has been debated for years. Former inmates describe losing track of time. Others describe talking to themselves simply to hear a human voice. Some report difficulty concentrating after extended isolation. The silence itself becomes a challenge. In these environments, prison ceases to be about physical confinement alone. It becomes a battle against the mind. And that battle can continue long after release. But there is another reason many inmates fear federal prison. One that affects them even after they walk out the gate. The stigma that follows you home. For most prisoners, release is supposed to be the finish line. The sentence ends. The gates open. Freedom returns. But many former federal inmates discover that prison follows them long after they leave. A federal conviction often carries a unique weight. Employers notice it. Licensing boards notice it. Financial institutions notice it. Landlords notice it. And because many federal cases involve extensive investigations, court records can remain easily accessible for years. Some former prisoners describe feeling as though they are still serving part of their sentence. Not behind bars, but in everyday life. The challenge becomes rebuilding an identity that was reduced to a case number. Finding employment. Restoring family relationships. Learning technology that changed during incarceration. Re-entering a society that continued moving without them. For someone who spent 15 or 20 years in federal prison, the outside world can feel unfamiliar. Entire industries appear and disappear. Cities transform. Friends move away. Parents age. Children become adults. The realization can be devastating. The punishment did not simply remove years. It removed entire eras of life. And yet, while re-entry is difficult, surviving federal prison itself requires understanding a set of unwritten rules that few outsiders ever hear about. Rules that often determine whether an inmate has a manageable sentence or a miserable one. Rule number 1, never draw attention. One lesson emerges repeatedly in interviews with former federal inmates. Stay off the radar. In many state prisons, physical strength or reputation may be the primary source of protection. Federal prison often rewards something different. Predictability. The inmate who constantly attracts attention becomes a problem. Problems generate reports. Reports generate scrutiny. Scrutiny creates complications. Experienced prisoners quickly learn how to blend into the routine. Show up for counts. Follow procedures. Avoid unnecessary conflicts. Maintain consistency. This doesn't guarantee safety. Nothing in prison does. But it reduces exposure to disciplinary action and unwanted attention. Many long-term inmates become experts at routine. They understand that surviving prison often means conserving energy. Every argument, Every confrontation, every unnecessary risk, comes with potential consequences. And inside federal prison, consequences tend to accumulate. What starts as a minor issue can slowly become a major obstacle. That reality creates a very different prison culture. One built less around chaos and more around calculation. The economy behind bars. Money still matters in prison. Even when actual cash is prohibited. Federal facilities develop complex informal economies. Commissary items become currency. Coffee, tuna, mackerel, stamps, instant noodles, hygiene products. Every item carries value. And where value exists, power follows. Some inmates accumulate influence through access to goods. Others provide services. Legal assistance, haircuts, artwork, cleaning, translation, advice. A prison economy emerges because human beings naturally create systems of exchange. But participation carries risks. Debts can create tension. Misunderstandings can create conflict. Trust becomes one of the most valuable commodities inside any institution. Federal prisoners often describe learning this lesson quickly. The wrong deal, the wrong partner, the wrong promise, can create months of problems. And unlike life outside prison, simply walking away is not always an option. Because everyone remains trapped inside the same walls. Day after day, year after year. The environment never changes. The people rarely disappear. That permanence creates pressures outsiders struggle to understand. The mental game. Ask former prisoners what the hardest part of federal time was, and many give an answer that surprises people. Not violence. Not food. Not physical conditions. The hardest challenge was psychological. Federal prison is a marathon, not a sprint. A sentence measured in decades requires a different survival strategy than a sentence measured in months. Every inmate eventually faces difficult questions. How do you remain motivated? How do you maintain hope? How do you avoid becoming consumed by regret? Some throw themselves into education. Federal prisons offer programs that allow inmates to earn diplomas, certifications, and college credits. Others focus on physical fitness. Many embrace religion. Some become jailhouse lawyers, spending years helping others navigate legal systems. These pursuits are not simply hobbies. For many inmates, they become survival mechanisms. Purpose creates structure. Structure creates stability. Without those anchors, prison can slowly erode a person's sense of identity. One former inmate described federal prison as living the same day thousands of times. That description appears again and again. Because eventually, the greatest enemy is not another prisoner. It's monotony. And monotony can be extraordinarily powerful. Why some inmates prefer state time? This may sound surprising. But some prisoners who have served time in both systems openly say they preferred state prison. Not because state facilities are easier. Many are not. Violence can be more common. Resources can be more limited. Conditions can be harsher. Yet some inmates still choose state prison if given the option. Why? Because state systems sometimes offer greater opportunities for release, parole, sentence modifications, different classification systems, more regional placement options, closer family connections. The possibility, however small, that a sentence might end sooner than expected. Federal prison often removes that uncertainty. At first glance, certainty sounds beneficial. But for many prisoners, certainty becomes its own punishment. Knowing exactly how many years remain can feel crushing. There is no board meeting to anticipate. No major hearing that might dramatically shorten a sentence. The date exists. And it often feels very far away. That reality changes how inmates experience time itself. The sentence becomes less about counting down and more about enduring. For some people, that's harder than any physical hardship. And there is one final reason federal prison often feels worse. A reason that affects every aspect of daily life. The system always wins. State prisons can be chaotic. Federal prisons are often described as something else entirely. Efficient, structured, methodical, and overwhelmingly powerful. Former inmates frequently say the most intimidating aspect of federal prison is realizing how little control they actually possess. Every movement depends on authorization. Every privilege can be revoked. Every decision can be reviewed. Every complaint enters a bureaucratic system that moves at its own pace. The institution always has more time, more resources, more authority. For inmates, that realization can be deeply unsettling. You cannot outlast the system. You cannot outspend the system. You cannot simply ignore it. You must learn to function within it. Day after day. Year after year. That is why many former federal prisoners describe incarceration not as a battle against individuals, but as a battle against an institution. an institution specifically designed to maintain control. And unlike a single guard or administrator, institutions do not get tired. They do not retire. They do not leave. They remain constant, predictable, and unavoidable. For some prisoners, that permanence becomes the most difficult challenge of all. The debate between federal prison and state prison has existed for decades. Some inmates will always argue that state prison is harder because of violence, overcrowding, and instability. Others insist federal prison is worse because of long sentences, strict control, isolation, and the psychological weight of knowing exactly how much time remains. The truth is that both systems can be extraordinarily difficult. Both remove freedom. Both separate families. Both leave lasting scars. But federal prison introduces a unique kind of punishment. A punishment built not only on confinement, but on structure. Not only on walls, but on time. Because when every day follows the same routine, when release feels unimaginably distant, when family lives thousands of miles away, when every action is documented, and when the institution controls nearly every aspect of existence, the sentence becomes something larger than imprisonment. It becomes a test of endurance, a test of patience, a test of identity. And for many who have lived through it, that is why federal time can feel worse than state time. Not because the cells are smaller, not because the food is worse, not because violence is more common, but because federal prison has a way of making years feel longer. And sometimes, that is the hardest punishment of all. And that brings us to the end of today's documentary. The realities of federal and state prison are often far different from what most people imagine. Behind the statistics, the policies, and the prison walls are real people navigating systems designed to control every aspect of daily life. If you found this documentary informative, let us know your thoughts in the comments. Which aspect of prison life surprised you the most? Thank you for watching, and don't forget to subscribe for more in-depth crime and prison documentaries. Until next time, stay informed, stay curious, and we'll see you in the next story.